Now we're going to take a look at North American indigenous societies. We're looking here because Mesoamerican trade actually interacted with many pre-contact Native American cultures, and along with trade in goods came trade in ideas. Native American cultures are grouped into periods of development like we see in many other parts of the world. Like for Europe, we have medieval times, the Renaissance, and so forth. For Native American groups, we identify some major cultural epochs: the Adena, Hopewell, Mississippian, and Woodland. Notice that these time periods overlap because they are describing cultural trends which differed among tribes. So while many Mississippian cultures had already disbanded by the 1400s, the Natchez in the southeast continued to live Mississippian lifestyles until the contact era. So let's look at what's happening in these different cultural periods. Adena sites are the first where we see mounds, and they built two types of mounds: burial mounds and effigy mounds in either geometric or animal shapes. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio is one of the most beautiful examples of an effigy mound. During the Adena period, we see early domestication of sunflower, marsh elder, and goosefoot, but no evidence of sedentism, meaning they may have been mobile farmers who planted crops, moved away, and returned to harvest them. This means they were also foraging and hunting part-time, which may explain why Adena skeletal remains exhibit high nutrient levels. However, some members of the culture are buried in mounds that took time and energy to build, while others were not, suggesting some kind of elite status or respect. Please see the short lecture on NAGPRA for a discussion of why examining indigenous human remains is controversial and no longer widely endorsed by archaeologists. I am required to provide you with the information, but just know that this is not a practice that's really done anymore these days, and we'll talk about that. The Hopewell era sites contain even larger mounds. The Hopewell-style burial mounds often feature one person in the center of the mound, and many people buried in mounds were buried with high-status items, goods that were either rare, from far away, or took a long time to produce. For example, a burial from the Ohio River Valley uncovered copper plates likely used as mirrors, from copper probably harvested from the Rocky Mountains, ear spools, copper axes, which would have been decorative only since an axe made of soft copper is basically useless, marine shells from the Atlantic Ocean, complex pottery, and more. From this, we know that there was very long-distance trade. Intensified ceramic technology suggests higher levels of sedentism, since pottery generally takes a kiln or other major non-mobile device to create. Foragers generally prefer basketry to pottery, since it is lightweight for travel and can be produced on the go. However, sites remain somewhat small and not heavily populated. Homes seem to remain small in size and with little differentiation between home sizes. In other words, people all live in equal houses during life, but some people get huge mound burials with elite goods while others don't. The Hopewell culture disbands with no apparent calamity to explain why. Many scholars believe that the growing inequality was distasteful enough for many people to vote with their feet and leave these Hopewell centers. There was a gap of time between the Hopewell and Mississippian periods, during which time many native people of various cultures lived decentralized lives, much like the Maya did after the Classic period ended. Then we see another trend forming which we labeled the Mississippian period. Although the Mississippian period in North America begins as the Classic Maya period is entering its violent late Classic phase, many scholars believe that this and earlier North American mound-building cultures were influenced by Mesoamerica and vice versa. I recently visited a Mississippian site, one I've been to a number of times in my youth, but whose museum has recently been updated. While there, I took a lot of pictures so I can take you on a virtual tour of the site during the course of this section on the Mississippian period. As I discuss Mississippian trends, you can see pictures from the Ocmulgee Mound site in central Georgia, the residents of which are still alive today in the form of the Muskogee Creek people. Unlike Adena and Hopewell sites, which were low in population and spread out over large areas, Mississippian sites are concentrated and often close to large rivers. Archaeologists argue that the connection to rivers is due to the intensification of farming to feed a larger and more concentrated population. A cultural anthropological view would add to the picture that in many cultures whose ancestors lived at these sites, water is a major part of spirituality as well. So a more complete picture of what the lives of these ancient people might have been like starts to form. Mississippian sites were heavily reliant on a new domesticated crop introduced slowly over time from Mesoamerica: corn. As a result, as you probably know to expect by now, their remains do show nutritional deficiencies and tooth decay, and we can hear oral history accounts of these health issues as well. Like in earlier time periods, we see burial mounds and effigy mounds, but we also see mounds for holding religious ceremonies inside of them, and mounds that had houses built atop them, very similar to the homes of priests/ahau in the classic Maya period. Trade during this time expands even beyond what it was in the Hopewell period, and there are some extreme burials that demonstrate both elite goods and therefore indicate the status of the people inside. Cahokia was a major Mississippian site. Located near present-day St. Louis and a designated UNESCO World Heritage Site, at its height in the 1200s, the city took up about 6 square miles, contained over 120 mounds, and held around 40,000 people. A larger city would not be seen in North America until the 1700s. The site contains huge platforms, post holes left over from large wooden walls, and a wood hinge likely to mark astronomical events. There are several burial mounds which also tell us a lot about the site. For one thing, in Mound 72, a burial mound, we see children in elite burials with high-status goods for the first time. What does this tell us about their society? Well, it means that you can be born into elite status, as opposed to having to earn that status through great deeds in life. Most 6-year-olds who pass away haven't done some great deed such that they would get that kind of burial. Instead, they probably came from elite parents. But the fact that this did not happen in Adena and Hopewell cultures tells us that those cultures did not bury with flair people born into elite families, only respected leaders themselves. Also in Mound 72 was one of the richest Mississippian burials. A young man was buried with 20,000 handmade mother-of-pearl beads, probably sewn onto a cloak that wore away with time, 1,000 unused arrowheads of standardized shapes and sizes, evidence of specialization and mass production, a raw sheet of mica, hammered copper, a set of gaming discs, which we also see at Ocmulgee, and which Spanish accounts described at several other sites, and finally, 3 other males and a female with high-status goods themselves. Many scholars believe that Hernando de Soto's 1539 mission through the southeast spread disease which led to the fall of the Mississippian sites. He did see several Mississippian sites that appeared to be in use. However, the major site of Cahokia had already disbanded prior to De Soto's journey, as had several others. Perhaps something happened at these sites, and with the trade system thrown off by the loss of Cahokia and other major sites, smaller sites tapered off as well. Some tribal stories say that, like the Hopewell culture, the bulk of the population grew tired of the rising inequality and violence, and decided to decentralize and move away from these sites. Academics are likely to argue about this for some time. I should mention again that these are merely epochs that we put on time periods and cultures, but these are not the tribes themselves. Just like there's no country of Renaissance, there's no Adena tribe, just a generalized cultural movement that includes a lot of different groups. I'd also like to note that I'm using the word tribe for groups of Native Americans because it's the word you're most likely familiar with. However, many Native Americans prefer the term nation, and in fact, the U.S. Constitution refers to Native Americans living in nations, not tribes. Native American nations do have a separate legal status, and some, like the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, print their own internationally recognized passports. In the time after the Mississippian period, different Native American tribes along the East Coast and the Midwest moved on to different cultural paths. Some invested in sedentism, farming domesticated foods, developing complex governing systems, and creating a warrior class for protection. Others invested totally in a foraging lifestyle, gathering wild foods, hunting, and fishing. Some groups combined foraging with farming, doing mobile farming like we saw at some Adena and Hopewell sites. The interesting thing to note is that most tribes knew about other tribes who were living very different lifestyles. In this course, we'll look at 2 cultural areas in particular, a group of tribes with similar languages and cultures labeled Algonquin, and a group of 5 tribes who added a 6th member into a confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, who you've probably heard called the Iroquois.